There comes a moment in a man's life that arrives without warning, without a grand announcement, without any of the fanfare we associate with major life decisions. It doesn't knock. It simply settles into his bones one ordinary afternoon, and suddenly everything that once felt familiar begins to feel like a costume he forgot to take off. You've seen this man. Perhaps he sits across from you at a family gathering, present in body, but so far away in spirit that you can almost see the distance in his eyes. Perhaps he was your friend, your brother, your partner, and now he barely speaks. Perhaps you've caught yourself wondering what happened to him, why he pulled away, why he stopped answering calls, why he chose silence over conversation. Or perhaps, in the quietest corner of your own heart, you recognize that this man is you. If you are that man, if you have felt that strange pull toward isolation without understanding why, or if you are trying to understand someone in your life who has suddenly withdrawn, I want to offer you a different lens through which to see this experience. Not as something broken, not as something wrong, but as something that, in the language of depth psychology, and particularly through the work of Carl Jung, might actually be the beginning of the most significant transformation a human being can undergo. Jung observed something remarkable about certain stages of psychological development. He noticed that they rarely begin with joy, with expansion, with the warm glow of healing. More often, they begin with withdrawal, with isolation, with the unsettling sensation that you no longer belong to the world you once called home. The men who step back from everything, who cut ties, who disappear from the radar of their own lives, may not be falling apart. They may be preparing to become who they actually are. This video is not here to judge that process or to rush you through it. It's here to illuminate what might actually be happening beneath the surface, in the psyche of a man who chooses to step away. Stay with me through to the end, because by the time we're finished, you may recognize that the distance you've been keeping from the world is not a wall. It's a doorway. Part 1. The mask no longer fits. Let's begin with the first quiet tremor that signals something has shifted deep within. It starts so subtly that even the man experiencing it might not name it at first. He's sitting with people he's known for years, people who would describe themselves as close to him, and suddenly he feels like an actor who has forgotten his lines. The conversation continues around him. Laughter rises and falls in all the right places. Someone asks him a question, and he answers, and his voice sounds like his voice, and his face looks like his face. But somewhere behind his eyes, there's a strange sensation of watching himself from a great distance. This is not the familiar discomfort of social anxiety or the temporary awkwardness of a bad day. This is something deeper. It's the moment when a man realizes that the version of himself he has been presenting to the world for years, sometimes decades, no longer matches the person he has quietly become on the inside. Carl Jung had a name for this version of ourselves that we present to the world. He called it the persona. And the persona, in Jung's understanding, is not inherently bad. It's the social mask we all wear, the face we put on to navigate relationships, to keep jobs, to be liked, to belong. The problem arises when the mask grows too thick, when we wear it for so long that we forget there's anything underneath. Think about it. From a very young age, most men learn that certain things are expected of them. Be strong. Don't show too much emotion. Be reliable. Be the one who holds things together. Be the listener, the fixer, the rock that everyone else can lean on. And for years, maybe for most of his life, he plays that role. He shows up when he's needed. He says the right things. He keeps his own struggles to himself, because that's what strong men do. He becomes so good at being what everyone else needs that he gradually loses touch with what he actually is when no one is watching. Jung put it this way: the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. Think about the weight of that statement. The persona is not who you are. It's who you and everyone around you have agreed to pretend you are. And when a man has lived inside that agreement for too long, something inside him eventually rebels. Not loudly, not with anger, but with a growing sense that he cannot breathe inside his own life anymore. A man I'll call Daniel, who reached out to this channel some months ago, described it perfectly. He told me about a dinner with his oldest friends, people he'd known since college, people who would swear they knew him better than anyone. And somewhere in the middle of a story someone was telling, a story about the old days, about the person Daniel used to be, he had a sudden, almost terrifying realization. The person they were talking about, the person they still expected him to be, no longer existed. That version of Daniel had died years ago, quietly, without anyone noticing. But everyone at that table was still relating to a ghost. And here's what Daniel said that struck me. He said it wasn't that his friends had done anything wrong. They hadn't hurt him, hadn't betrayed him, hadn't given him any reason to pull away. But sitting there, surrounded by people who loved a version of him that no longer lived, Daniel felt more alone than he'd ever felt in his entire life. That night, he started refusing invitations. Not out of anger, not to punish anyone, but because every time he showed up, he had to become someone he no longer was. This is the first truth about the man who cuts off everything. He is not running from people. He is running from the unbearable weight of pretending. He is protecting himself from the slow erosion that happens every time he smiles when he doesn't feel like smiling, every time he agrees when he doesn't agree, every time he shows up as someone else just to keep the peace. And once that awareness has dawned, once he has seen clearly that the mask is a mask, there is almost no going back. You cannot unknow what you have come to know. So let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this honestly for a moment. Have you ever left a conversation feeling emptier than when you arrived? Have you ever been surrounded by people who love you and still felt completely unseen? Have you ever performed the role of a good friend, a good partner, a good son, so flawlessly that no one noticed you were disappearing inside your own life? If any of that resonates, if something in you just stirred at those questions, don't push it away. Don't explain it away. Just recognize that something in you is asking to be seen, and that recognition, that simple, honest acknowledgement, is the first step toward understanding what comes next. Part 2. The drain they never noticed. When a man can no longer recognize himself inside his relationships, something else begins to happen. It doesn't happen all at once. It's more like a slow leak, the kind you don't notice until you look back and realize how much has drained away. He starts to notice that every interaction costs him something. Every conversation, every gathering, every obligation leaves him a little more tired, a little more empty, a little more aware that he is giving something he never gets back. From a Jungian perspective, this is about something Jung called psychic energy, or libido, not libido in the narrow sexual sense that Freud emphasized, but libido as a broader life force, the energy that fuels our interests, our passions, our connections, our very will to live. In a healthy psychological system, this energy flows in two directions. It goes out toward others, in the form of care, attention, love, and it returns to the self in the form of nourishment, validation, the feeling of being seen and valued in return. But in many relationships, particularly for men who have spent their lives as the strong one, the reliable one, the one everyone leans on, that flow becomes dangerously one-directional. Think about the man I'm describing. For years, maybe his entire adult life, he has been the person everyone turns to. When a friend is in crisis, he's the first call. When a family member needs help, he shows up without being asked. When someone needs advice, needs money, needs a place to stay, needs someone to listen at 2 a.m., he's there. He does this because he genuinely cares, but also because somewhere along the way, He learned that his value as a human being is measured by his usefulness to others. If he is needed, he exists. If he stops being needed, what is he? Jung recognized this pattern in what he called the wounded healer archetype. This is a psychological configuration where a person's sense of worth becomes entangled with their ability to carry pain, to solve problems, to hold space for others, while their own wounds go completely unattended. The wounded healer gives and gives and gives, not from genuine abundance, but from an unconscious belief that giving is the only way to earn the right to stay. And because this belief is unconscious, because it operates beneath the level of awareness, the man doesn't even realize he's bleeding out. Then comes the moment of awakening. It's not dramatic. It's not a confrontation or a blow-up. It's just a quiet observation. He starts to notice that when he reaches out, when he's the one who needs something, the response is different. People are busy. People don't call back. People change the subject when he tries to share his own struggles. Conversations that used to flow easily now feel like pulling teeth, unless the topic is someone else's problem. He notices that his value in these relationships is entirely conditional on what he provides. The moment he stops providing, the connection falters. A man named Marcus shared a story with me that captures this perfectly. For over a decade, Marcus was the emotional backbone of his friend group. He was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, who checked in after hard days, who mediated conflicts, who showed up with food and presents whenever someone was going through something. He did this naturally, without resentment, because he genuinely loved his people. But one year, Marcus went through something himself. A divorce, a health scare, a period of profound darkness. And when he reached out to the people he had carried for so long, when he said, "I'm struggling, I need someone to hold space for me," the silence was deafening. A few people sent brief texts. Most said nothing. And within weeks, the group chat was back to business as usual, discussing someone else's drama, as if Marcus's cry for help had never happened. That moment changed something in Marcus. Not bitterness, not anger, but a devastating clarity. He saw for the first time that he had not been in relationships with these people. He had been functioning as an emotional utility, a resource they drew from without ever replenishing. And in that clarity, he began to withdraw, not to punish, not to make a point, but because continuing to show up would have meant continuing to pour from an empty well. And he finally understood that if he kept pouring, there would eventually be nothing left of him at all. Jung once wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." For the man who realizes he has been drained, this is the hell he must descend into. The hell of seeing clearly that many of the people he loved did not love him back in the way he needed. The hell of accepting that his value to them was transactional. The hell of sitting with the grief of that recognition without looking away. But here's what I want you to consider. Is it better to remain in relationships that slowly kill you? Relationships that take everything and give nothing, just to avoid the pain of being alone? Or is it better to face that pain head on, to withdraw your energy from structures that deplete you, and to begin the long, slow work of rebuilding yourself from the inside out? The man who cuts off everything has answered that question, not impulsively, not without grief, but with the quiet certainty of someone who finally understands that protecting his own life force is not selfishness. It's survival. Part 3. The death of approval seeking. There's a stage in this process that often goes unnoticed by everyone except the man experiencing it. It's the stage where something inside him stops needing what it once desperately craved. For most of his life, his decisions, his behavior, even his thoughts have been filtered through a constant, almost invisible question: what will people think? He needed approval to feel safe. He needed recognition to know he was on the right path. He needed constant reassurance that he was doing it right, being enough, measuring up. This need for external validation doesn't appear from nowhere. It's planted early, often in childhood, in moments when a boy learns that his safety, his belonging, his very worth depends on meeting someone else's expectations. A harsh parent, an unpredictable environment, a family where love was conditional on performance. All of these can wire a developing psyche to believe that approval is something that must be earned, constantly, at any cost. A friend of mine named Omar grew up in exactly this kind of environment. His father was a man who measured everything by results, by achievement, by whether you were winning or losing in the eyes of the world. Love and attention flowed when Omar succeeded and dried up completely when he struggled. By the time Omar was an adult, this dynamic had become the template for every relationship in his life. Without even realizing it, he approached every connection with the same desperate question. Am I doing this right? Are you still pleased with me? Have I earned my place? From a Jungian perspective, this is a sign that the ego has become dangerously identified with external standards. The man's sense of self is not anchored within his own being. It's anchored in the reflection he sees in other people's eyes. And because other people's eyes are always shifting, always conditional, always unpredictable, this foundation is never stable. He can succeed 100 times and still feel one failure away from worthlessness. But here's what eventually happens, and it's one of the most profound shifts a human being can experience. The system collapses, not because he decides to change it, but because life itself, through accumulated experience, through enough disappointments, through enough moments of giving everything and still being criticized, still being left, still not being enough, eventually forces him to see the truth. The truth is that no amount of external validation can ever fill the void left by an absent relationship with yourself. Jung said something that cuts straight to the heart of this. He said, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem." Think about that. The essence of the whole moral problem. Not how well you follow rules, not how others judge you, not whether you meet society's standards, but whether you can accept yourself. Whether you can look at who you actually are, with all your contradictions, all your darkness, all your unfulfilled potential, and say yes to yourself without waiting for anyone else's permission. When that shift happens in a man, when he stops asking the world for permission to exist as himself, everything changes. He stops explaining. He stops justifying. He stops trying to make people understand why he needs distance, why he's different now, why he can't keep showing up the way he used to. He finally understands something that had always eluded him. The people who genuinely love him will respect his boundaries even without explanations. And the people who only love the version of him that sought their approval will never understand, no matter how many words he uses. Omar described this shift as a kind of death. For weeks after he stopped trying to manage everyone's perception of him, he felt adrift, disoriented, like a ship that had lost its navigation system. He had spent his whole life steering by the lights of other people's expectations, and now those lights were gone. But slowly, in the darkness, he began to notice something else. A different kind of light, coming from somewhere inside. Faint at first, easily mistaken for imagination, but growing steadier the more he paid attention. It was his own voice, his own sense of what mattered, his own values, not borrowed from anyone. And once he tasted what it felt like to live from that place, there was no going back. So let me ask you, and I want you to be honest with yourself. How much of your energy goes into managing how others see you? How many decisions do you make based on what people might think? How much of your life is spent trying to earn approval that, even when you get it, never quite satisfies? If you're tired of that game, if you're ready to stop performing and start living, leave a sign in the comments. Just a word, a sentence. Anything that marks this moment as the beginning of something real. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be honest about where you are. Part 4. The re-education of solitude. When a man no longer needs external validation, something else opens up. The solitude that once felt like punishment begins to feel like something else entirely. It's a gradual shift, almost imperceptible at first. He stops dreading the empty hours and starts noticing that they're not actually empty. They're full of things he never had space to hear before. This is a critical turning point because it marks the difference between two very different kinds of withdrawal. There's the man who isolates himself because he's avoiding something, because he's wounded and hiding, because he can't face the world. And then there's the man who chooses solitude because he's discovered that being alone is actually more nourishing than being in relationships where he isn't truly seen. The first is escape. The second is election. From Jung's perspective, this election of solitude represents a profound shift in the distribution of psychic energy. For most of his life, that energy has been directed outward, toward meeting expectations, maintaining connections, performing roles. But now, something is calling it back. Jung would say that the psyche is withdrawing its investment from the collective, from the mass of shared assumptions about what matters, in order to turn toward the individuation process. And individuation, the lifelong work of becoming your actual self, requires solitude the way a seed requires darkness before it can sprout. Most people fear being alone, because when the noise of others falls away, they're left with something they've spent their whole lives avoiding. Themselves, their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own unmet needs, their own unexamined pain. It's easier to fill the space with distractions, with shallow connections, with busyness that passes for meaning. But the man who has cut off everything has made a different choice. He has sat in the silence long enough to discover that it's not empty at all. It's brimming with things he couldn't hear when the world was too loud. I think of my neighbor Elias, who lives alone in a small apartment across the hall. When I first moved in, people warned me about him. They said he kept to himself, didn't come to building events, rarely spoke to anyone. They said it with that particular tone people use when they're describing someone they've decided is sad or broken. But over time, I came to know Elias differently. Not through long conversations, because we don't have many, but through observation. I see him every morning, sitting by his window as the sun comes up, a book in his lap, a cup of coffee in his hand, utterly at peace. I see him tending the small plants on his balcony, carefully, patiently, as if they matter. I see him walking in the evening, not hurried, not anxious, just present. One day I asked him if he ever got lonely. He smiled in a way that made me feel like I'd asked a child's question. He said, "Before I lived alone, I was surrounded by people and felt invisible every day. Now I'm alone, and I finally feel seen. By myself." That's the re-education of solitude. It's learning that your own company is not a consolation prize. It's the foundation. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." In solitude, that communication turns inward. The man begins to have conversations with himself that he never had time for before. He starts to hear his own real thoughts, not the thoughts he was supposed to have. He starts to recognize his own real values, not the values he inherited. He starts to remember dreams he postponed, passions he buried, parts of himself he sacrificed on the altar of belonging. And here's what happens next. Once that internal relationship is restored, once he knows what it feels like to be truly at home in his own being, returning to false relationships becomes unbearable. Not because he's angry or bitter, but because he can't unlearn what he's learned. He can't go back to breathing air that suffocates him. So his circle shrinks, sometimes, to almost nothing. But the connections that remain, or that he forms later, are built on a foundation that didn't exist before. They're chosen, not needed. They're wanted, not clung to, and that makes them worth more than 100 shallow connections put together. Part 5. The wound that changes everything. But we have to be honest about something. Not every man chooses solitude simply because he's discovered its beauty. Many choose it because they've been hurt in ways that make trust feel like a risk they can never take again. This is perhaps the most hidden aspect of the man who cuts off everything. The part he almost never talks about. The part that doesn't show up in surface explanations. There's a particular kind of wound that doesn't just hurt. It restructures everything. It's the wound of betrayal by someone he trusted completely. Not a stranger. Not an enemy. Not someone he was already cautious around. Someone he loved. Someone he believed in. Someone he would have protected with his own life. When that kind of trust is shattered, something fundamental shifts in the psyche. The world stops feeling safe in a way that no amount of reassurance can fully fix. Jung understood this. He wrote, "All the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They must be so, for they express the necessary polarity inherent in every self-regulating system. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." Betrayal is one of those insoluble problems. You can't logic your way out of it. You can't find the right explanation that makes it okay. You can only live with the contradiction, the simultaneous knowledge that you long for connection, and can never return to the innocence that made connection feel safe. A man I'll call Julian shared his story with me during a conversation that stayed with me for weeks. Julian had a business partner, a friend of 20 years, someone he trusted with everything. They'd built a company together, weathered crises together, celebrated victories together. Julian would have told you, without hesitation, that this man was his brother. Then the company hit a rough patch. Nothing catastrophic, just the normal pressures of a competitive market, and Julian discovered that his partner had been quietly preparing an exit strategy that protected himself and left Julian exposed. Not just exposed, but betrayed in ways that used information Julian had shared in confidence. Vulnerabilities he'd revealed over decades of friendship, all weaponized to secure his partner's escape. Julian said the financial damage was real, but it wasn't what broke him. What broke him was the moment of realization. The moment he understood that the person he would have died for had been planning to sacrifice him all along. After that, Julian didn't become bitter. He didn't rage or seek revenge. But he changed. Profoundly. He stopped assuming good intent. He stopped trusting by default. He stopped opening the door of his inner world to anyone who knocked. Not because he hated people, but because he had learned something that couldn't be unlearned. Trust given freely is trust that can destroy you. This is the wound that doesn't show. It lives beneath the surface, invisible to everyone who wonders why he's pulled away. They see distance and call it coldness. They see caution and call it arrogance. They see silence and call it rejection. But what they don't see is the moment that changed everything. The moment when someone he loved proved that love is not protection. The moment when the world divided into before and after requires a vigilance that before never imagined. Jung would say that this man is not broken. He's been initiated. Initiation into the truth that not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well. Not every relationship that feels safe actually is. Not every bond that claims to be unbreakable will hold when tested. This is a harsh wisdom, and no one seeks it. But once it's been given, once you've paid the price of acquiring it, you can't pretend you don't know. So if you're judging a man for his distance, if you're wondering why he doesn't trust the way he used to, if you're frustrated by walls he's built that you didn't build, ask yourself a harder question. What might have happened to him that you don't know about? What might he have learned, through pain you can't imagine, that makes your casual expectations of access feel naive. The man who cuts off everything after betrayal isn't punishing you. He's protecting the only self he has left. And until you've walked through the fire that taught him to protect it, you might not have the right to judge how carefully he guards the door. Part 6. The Underground River. We've walked through a lot together in this video. We've looked at the mask that no longer fits, the drain that finally became visible, the death of approval seeking, the re-education of solitude, the wound that changes everything. And now we arrive at the place where all of these threads converge, the place where the man who has cut off everything is not ending something, but beginning something. Something that Carl Jung called individuation. Individuation is one of those words that sounds abstract until you've lived it. It's not about becoming special or superior. It's not about separating from humanity or declaring yourself above the common herd. It's something both simpler and more difficult. It's the process of becoming who you actually are. Beneath all the layers of expectation, all the roles you've played, all the masks you've worn, all the compromises you've made to belong. Jung wrote, "Individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to oneself." But here's the paradox. Before it can gather the world, it requires withdrawal. Before it can connect authentically, it requires separation. Before it can bring you back to others in a new way, it requires you to leave the old ways of being with others behind. This is why the man who cuts off everything is not necessarily lost. He may be in the middle of the most important work of his life. Think of the hermit archetype that appears in virtually every wisdom tradition. The hermit is not someone who hates people. The hermit is someone who understands that before you can bring anything of value back to the community, you have to spend time away from it. You have to go into the wilderness, into the cave, into the silence, and find there what cannot be found in the noise. The lamp the hermit carries is lit in solitude, and only then can it illuminate anything for anyone else. For the man in individuation, this is exactly what's happening. He's in the cave. He's in the silence. He's in the space where the old voices have faded and the new ones haven't yet become clear. And this space is uncomfortable, not just for him, but for everyone who knew the old version. Because the old version was predictable. The old version played his role. The old version showed up and performed and made everyone else feel comfortable in their assumptions. The new version, the one being forged in the underground, doesn't do any of that yet. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Notice the word privilege, not burden, not curse, not problem to be solved. Privilege, because the alternative, the path not taken, is to go to your grave having never known who you actually were. Having played someone else's part, for someone else's audience your entire life. Having never once spoken in your own voice. The man who cuts off everything has chosen the privilege, even if it doesn't feel like privilege yet. Even if it feels like loss, like loneliness, like not belonging anywhere. He has chosen the difficult path of becoming real, and that path requires him to face things he spent his whole life avoiding. His own shadow, the parts of himself he denied, the anger he suppressed, the exhaustion he ignored, the dreams he buried. All of it rises in the silence, demanding to be seen. This confrontation with the shadow is not comfortable. Jung called it the meeting with oneself, and he said it's one of the most difficult meetings you'll ever attend. Because the shadow contains everything you've rejected, everything you've been taught is unacceptable, everything you've hidden even from yourself. When that material rises, you can't go back to pretending it doesn't exist. You can't return to the old innocence, the old simplicity, the old way of being that required you to be half a person. So the man in individuation sits with it, not because he wants to, but because he has to. because the alternative is to remain forever divided, forever performing, forever unknown to himself. And once you've tasted even a glimpse of what it might feel like to be whole, the old divided life becomes impossible. Imagine an old house that's been running on a faulty electrical system for decades. Lights flickering, circuits overloaded, power draining constantly, because it's been wired to serve every demand except its own. One night, the whole system shuts down. Complete darkness. And in that darkness, the owner finally sees what he couldn't see when the lights were on. Walls that were built only to impress visitors. Rooms he's never entered. A foundation that needs repair. In the darkness, he begins the work, not because he wants to live in darkness forever, but because the work can only happen when the old lights are off. This is the man who cuts off everything. He's not turning away from life. He's turning off the lights that were never his, so he can finally see what is. He's withdrawing from relationships that required him to be someone else, so he can discover who he actually is. He's stepping back from the world, not to reject it, but to prepare for a different kind of return. A return where he brings himself, not a costume. A return where his presence is real, not performed. A return where the connection he offers is worth having, because it's actually him. Conclusion. If you've stayed with me through to this moment, if you've walked through all of this territory without looking away, I want to leave you with something. Not a conclusion that wraps everything up neatly, because nothing about this process is neat, but an invitation to see differently. The man who cuts off everything, whether that man is someone you know or someone you are, is not necessarily cold, not necessarily broken, not necessarily lost. He may be in the middle of the most important work a human being can do. The work of becoming real. The work of stripping away everything that isn't him, so that what remains is actually him. The work of descending into his own darkness, so that he can eventually bring light that's actually his. This work costs something. It costs relationships that can't survive the change. It costs the comfort of belonging without having to be yourself. It costs the easy approval that came from playing a role well. But what it buys, if he stays with it, if he doesn't turn back, is something that cannot be bought any other way. Himself. Not a version shaped by expectations. Not a performance polished for approval. Not a mask worn so long it fused with his face. Himself. Jung said, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." The man in individuation has chosen meaning over magnitude. He has chosen to be a small, real thing, rather than a large, false one. And that choice, however lonely it feels right now, however misunderstood by everyone who knew the old version, is the foundation of everything real that will follow. If you are that man, if you recognize yourself in any part of what we've explored today, I want you to hear something. You don't have a problem. You're not wrong for needing space. You're not cold for pulling away. You're not broken for no longer fitting where you used to fit. You're waking up. And waking up always requires leaving behind what no longer fits the truth of who you're becoming. The people who belong in your life, the ones who are meant to be there when you come through this, will understand. They'll respect your boundaries without needing endless explanations. They'll see the meaning in your journey even if they can't follow you into every part of it. And the ones who can't, the ones who demand that you stay small so they can stay comfortable, may never have been meant to accompany you on this path at all. So place your hand on your chest if you're willing. Take a breath and let yourself admit, even if only in the privacy of your own heart, that this journey you're on, this strange, difficult, lonely journey, is not an ending. It's a transformation. And when you whisper to yourself, "I choose myself. I respect my journey. I trust my path," that's not a declaration to the world. It's a promise to the only person who will walk with you all the way to the end. Yourself.